My name is Antonia, and I'm 28 years old. Never in my life did I think I would find myself in the middle of a lavish ballroom with my mother-in-law screaming at me to leave, while wealthy guests watched in stunned silence. What began as my engagement party turned into the most humiliating night of my life. But little did they know I had a plan that would change everything. If you're watching this, please hit like and subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to see how I turned this nightmare into the most satisfying victory of my life. Growing up in Chicago, my life was comfortable, but certainly not extravagant. My parents provided a stable middle-class home until I turned 12 when their marriage fell apart spectacularly. The divorce wasn't just messy, it was public with accusations flying from both sides that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about trust and relationships. My father moved across the country to Seattle, becoming increasingly distant with each passing year. My mother did her best working 2 jobs to keep our life somewhat stable. Those formative teenage years taught me to be self-reliant and cautious about depending on others. School became my refuge. I threw myself into academics, particularly mathematics and computer science. My teachers noticed my aptitude and encouraged me to apply for scholarships. By senior year, I'd secured a full ride to Northwestern University, where I double majored in computer science and business administration. College was transformative. For the first time, I was surrounded by ambitious peers who pushed me to think bigger. While other students spent weekends partying, I interned at tech startups, absorbing everything I could about building successful businesses. I joined coding competitions, won hackathons, and built a network of mentors who saw potential in me. After graduation, New York City called to me like a beacon. With nothing but 2 suitcases, $5,000 in savings, and a job offer from a small tech company, I moved into a tiny apartment in Brooklyn that I shared with 2 roommates. The salary barely covered my expenses, but I was in the city where dreams came true, and that was all that mattered. By day, I worked diligently at my entry-level programming job. By night, I developed my own ideas coding until the early morning hours. 2 years of this double life led to the creation of my first viable product, a security software that helped small businesses protect customer data at a fraction of what larger solutions cost. At 24, I took the biggest risk of my life. I quit my job, cashed out my meager 401k, and launched my company Secure Small. The first year was brutal. I lived on ramen noodles, worked 18-hour days, and faced rejection from countless investors who couldn't see my vision. The breakthrough came when a prominent retail chain suffered a massive data breach that cost them millions. Suddenly, data security for small and medium businesses wasn't just nice to have, it was essential. My affordable solution was perfectly positioned and orders began trickling in. By year 2, the trickle had become a stream. I hired my first employees, moved into a real office, and finally paid myself enough to afford a decent 1-bedroom apartment. Year 3 brought the real watershed moment when a venture capital firm recognized our potential and invested $5 million. That investment transformed everything. Secure Small expanded rapidly, growing to 50 employees. Our client base expanded internationally. By my 27th birthday, my company was valued at $30 million, and I found myself in the surreal position of being a self-made millionaire. Despite my professional success, my personal life remained stagnant. I dated occasionally, but my trust issues from childhood created invisible barriers. Men either found me too intimidating or were only interested in my growing wealth and status. Neither option appealed to me, so I remained single, telling myself I was too busy for serious relationships anyway. Then came the charity gala that changed everything. My company had donated a substantial sum to a cybersecurity education initiative, and I attended the fundraiser as a representative. Dressed in a simple black dress, I was examining the silent auction items when someone reached for the same bid sheet. "Sorry," a warm voice said. "Seems we have similar taste." I looked up into the most sincere brown eyes I'd ever seen, belonging to a tall man in a well-cut but not flashy suit. "It's fine," I replied. "You can have this one. There are plenty of other items." "Actually," he said with a smile that created the perfect dimple in his right cheek, "I'd rather discuss a compromise over drinks." Come on. His name was James Harrington, and he worked in sustainable architecture. That night we talked for hours about everything from climate change to our favorite breakfast cereals. Not once did he ask about my company or seem impressed by my accomplishments, which was refreshingly different from my usual interactions. I expected the typical next day text that never arrives, but James called that very afternoon asking to see me again. Still, I was cautious. I made him wait 2 weeks before agreeing to a second date. He persisted with good humor, sending thoughtful messages that showed he'd been listening to the things I cared about. 8 magical months followed. James was different from anyone I'd dated before. He listened more than he talked, remembered small details, and never made me feel like I needed to be less successful to protect his ego. When I had to cancel dates because of work emergencies, he brought dinner to my office instead of complaining. When I spoke about my dreams for the company, he asked insightful questions and offered encouragement. One peculiar thing I noticed was James's reluctance to discuss his family or childhood in detail. He mentioned growing up back east and referred to his parents as traditional, but quickly changed the subject whenever I probed deeper. Having my own complicated family history, I respected his boundaries and didn't push. After 8 months together on a weekend trip to the Berkshires, James proposed during a sunrise hike. The ring was understated but obviously expensive, a single perfect diamond in a platinum setting. Through happy tears, I said yes, unable to believe that I'd found someone who loved me for exactly who I was. That same evening, over champagne in our cabin, James finally opened up about his family. "Now that we're engaged," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous, "there's something I should have told you earlier." My heart raced with sudden anxiety. "Secret wife. Criminal past health issues. My family has money," he said, which seemed anticlimactic until he clarified. "I mean a lot of money. Old money. The kind that comes with expectations and traditions." As James explained, I realized I'd unwittingly fallen in love with the son of Richard and Margaret Harrington. The Harringtons weren't just wealthy, they were American aristocracy, with a fortune dating back to railroad investments in the 1800s. They owned properties across the globe, influenced politics through substantial donations, and maintained a strict code about who was acceptable in their social circle. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, feeling somehow deceived, despite the fact that James lived modestly and paid his own way. "Because everyone treats me differently when they know," he said, taking my hands. "Women see me as a meal ticket. Men see me as a connection. You're the first person who just saw me as James." Antonia. He explained that he'd built his career deliberately separate from his family's influence. His architectural firm focused on sustainable, affordable housing projects, often at odds with the luxury developments his family typically invested in. "My parents have certain expectations," he continued, his expression darkening. "They've never approved of anyone I've dated. My last serious girlfriend was from a good family, but studied art history instead of something practical. They made her feel so unwelcome, she eventually broke things off." As James shared more stories about his parents' judgment, my anxiety grew. Margaret Harrington was apparently a social gatekeeper who could trace her lineage to the Mayflower. Richard Harrington expected his son to eventually take over the family's vast business interests rather than waste his talent on bleeding heart projects. "They're going to hate me," I said, voicing my sudden fear. "They'll love you once they know you," James insisted, but the slight hesitation in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The following week, James received a call from his mother. News of our engagement had reached her through family friends, and she was insistent on meeting me. A formal dinner was arranged at the Harrington estate in Connecticut for the following month. As the date approached, my anxiety spiraled. I confided in my best friend Sophia during an emergency wine night at my apartment. "I'm from a broken middle-class family," I lamented, pouring more Cabernet. "My company is successful but new money. I didn't go to boarding school or get presented at a debutante ball or whatever these people do." "So what?" Sophia countered. "You're smart, successful, and you make James happy. If they can't see that, it's their loss." But as I described the snippets James had shared about his mother's elitism and his father's traditional values, even Sophia looked concerned. "Maybe you need to test them," she suggested after her third glass. "See what they're really like before you commit to joining this family." "What do you mean?" A mischievous smile spread across her face. "What if you didn't go as the successful CEO? What if you showed up as someone they'd normally look down on just to see how they react?" The idea was absurd, impulsive, and potentially disastrous. It was also exactly what I decided to do. The plan started simply enough. I would present myself as Anna, a simplified version of Antonia from a small farming town in Pennsylvania. Instead of a tech CEO, I would be a retail worker who grew up poor with a single mother. The goal was to see if James's parents could accept someone based on character rather than status. My research was meticulous. I spent hours watching videos of rural Pennsylvania accents, practicing until I could maintain a subtle but consistent shift in my speech pattern. Nothing too exaggerated, just enough to suggest a different background than my actual Chicago upbringing. I created a detailed backstory raised by a single mother who worked as a waitress after my fictitious father abandoned us when I was 5. We struggled financially, but my mother instilled strong values of hard work and honesty. I started working at 16 to help with bills, never had the opportunity for college, and now worked as an assistant manager at a retail store where I met James when he came in shopping. Shopping for my Anna wardrobe was a surreal experience. I normally wore designer business attire or casual but expensive weekend clothes. Now I found myself in department stores selecting items that were respectable but clearly not high-end. I chose a simple navy blue dress for the dinner, modest costume jewelry, and practical pumps instead of my usual Louboutins. When James asked about my outfit choices for meeting his parents, I told him I wanted to show them the real me without flashy trappings. I want them to see who I really am inside, not be distracted by external things, I explained. James seemed touched by this sentiment, if slightly confused. They'll love you no matter what you wear, he assured me though, again with that hint of uncertainty. Rehearsing with Sophia was both helpful and nerve-wracking. She played the role of a judgmental Margaret Harrington, asking probing questions about my background, education, and career aspirations. "What does your mother do?" Sophia asked in a haughty tone. "She's a waitress at a local diner," I replied, slipping into my slightly altered accent. "Been there 20 years now. Raised me on her own after my dad left." "And your education?" "High school graduate. Always wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it. Had to start working right away to help Mom with the bills." We practiced for hours, refining my responses and mannerisms. The goal wasn't to seem uneducated or uncultured just from a simpler working-class background. I wanted to see if the Harringtons could appreciate values like work ethic and honesty over pedigree and wealth. The night before the dinner, James stayed at my apartment. As we lay in bed, my stomach churned with anxiety about the deception I was planning. "Are you sure they'll be okay with someone like me?" I asked, testing the waters. "Someone who doesn't come from money or connections." James pulled me closer. "They can be difficult and set in their ways, but they want me to be happy, and you make me happier than I've ever been." His words should have comforted me, but they only intensified my guilt. Still, I reasoned this wasn't just some malicious prank. It was a test to protect our future. If his parents couldn't accept a working-class version of me, how could I trust they'd ever truly accept the real me, self-made wealth, and all? The next morning, as we drove to Connecticut in James's Audi, I silently rehearsed my Anna persona while watching the landscape change from urban to increasingly affluent suburbs. The knot in my stomach tightened with each passing mile. "You're quiet," James noted, reaching for my hand. "Just nervous," I replied, which was certainly true. "Don't be," he smiled. "Just be yourself and they'll see what I see." The cruel irony of his advice wasn't lost on me. The Harrington estate exceeded even my wildest imagination. As we drove through wrought iron gates and up a tree-lined driveway that seemed to stretch for half a mile, I caught my first glimpse of what James simply called the house. It was a sprawling Georgian mansion of red brick with white columns, perfectly manicured gardens, and what appeared to be a separate guest house, larger than my entire apartment building. "You grew up here," I whispered momentarily, forgetting my role. "One of the places," James replied casually. "The summer house in Newport is actually bigger." A uniformed staff member appeared as soon as we parked, greeting James by name and taking our overnight bags. James had mentioned we'd be staying the night, but hadn't prepared me for the formal grandeur awaiting us. The entrance hall featured a sweeping staircase, crystal chandelier, and oil portraits of stern-looking Harringtons from previous generations. I felt like I'd stepped onto the set of Downton Abbey, except this wasn't a production, this was James's actual life. Margaret and Richard Harrington awaited us in what James called the small sitting room, though it was larger than my entire office. Margaret was tall and slender with perfectly coiffed silver blonde hair and the kind of surgically maintained face that appeared ageless in a slightly unnerving way. Richard was imposing in different ways, broad-shouldered with steel grey hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate my net worth as I entered. "James, darling," Margaret said, air-kissing her son on both cheeks before turning her laser focus on me. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes cooled noticeably. "And you must be Antonia." "Anna, actually," I corrected gently, extending my hand. "Everyone calls me Anna." Her handshake was brief and limp. "Charming," she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. What an interesting accent you have. Connecticut. Pennsylvania? I replied. Small town you probably haven't heard of. Richard's handshake was firmer, his assessment more direct. James tells us you work in retail. I noticed James's slight frown at this inaccurate information, but pressed forward. Yes, sir. Assistant manager at Dalton's department store. Been there 5 years now. Fascinating, Richard said flatly. Drinks before dinner, James your usual scotch. As a staff member served drinks, Margaret guided us to a seating area where I perched awkwardly on an antique settee that probably cost more than my first car. I deliberately chose a white wine when offered options, though I knew enough about fine wines to recognize the Montrachet they served was worth hundreds per bottle. So Anna, Margaret began emphasizing my name as if it were foreign and distasteful. Tell us about your family background. And so my performance began. I spoke about my fictional mother waiting tables at the local diner, embellishing with details about her arthritis from years of carrying heavy trays. I mentioned starting work at 16 at a local grocery store, then moving up to retail after high school. I sprinkled my speech with slightly improper grammar and made sure to express wide-eyed wonder at the Harringtons' home. Gosh, your house is just like something from a movie, I gushed, noting Margaret's subtle wince at my enthusiasm. James watched me with increasing confusion, clearly bewildered by this version of his fiancé, who bore little resemblance to the confident, articulate woman he knew. Several times he attempted to steer the conversation toward topics he knew I was knowledgeable about, but I carefully maintained my facade of simple working-class Anna. The situation grew more complicated when additional dinner guests arrived. James hadn't mentioned that his sister Catherine would be joining us along with an older couple introduced as longtime family friends, the Prestons. Catherine Harrington was immediately intimidating in a different way than her mother. Where Margaret exuded old money frostiness, Catherine had sharp intelligence in her eyes. She was younger than James by a few years, dressed in a simple but obviously expensive black dress, and regarded me with undisguised curiosity. Anna, she said, testing my name as we were introduced. James has told us embarrassingly little about you. How did you two meet again? Before I could repeat my fabricated meeting story, James jumped in. At the cybersecurity benefit last fall, I laughed nervously. Oh, James likes to make our meeting sound fancier than it was. I was actually working that night helping with the coat check. James's expression shifted from confusion to concern. I could see him trying to reconcile this version of events with reality, but he said nothing to contradict me. When we moved to the dining room, the opulence intensified. A table that could seat 20 was set for 7 of us, with fine china crystal and enough silverware to confuse anyone not raised with formal dining etiquette. I deliberately hesitated before selecting utensils, noting Margaret's disapproving glance when I used the wrong fork for the salad course. Throughout the elaborate 5-course meal, I maintained my role as Anna, the simple retail worker, expressing amazement at foods I'd actually eaten many times before, and asking naive questions about the Harringtons' lifestyle. Margaret grew increasingly cold, Richard increasingly dismissive, and James increasingly uncomfortable. Catherine, however, was watching me with growing suspicion. Unlike her parents, she seemed less concerned with my supposed background and more focused on inconsistencies in my story. Anna, she said during the main course. James mentioned you grew up in Pennsylvania, but I thought I detected a Midwestern accent earlier. Did you live somewhere else before? Oh no, I fumbled. Born and raised in Oakfield. Maybe you're hearing my mama's influence. She grew up in Ohio. Interesting, Catherine replied. And which department do you manage at Dalton's Women's Wear Cosmetics? A bit of everything, I replied vaguely. I float between departments. How versatile, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The conversation grew more strained as dinner progressed. Margaret made thinly veiled references to James's previous girlfriend from a lovely Boston family, while Richard interrogated me about my life goals, clearly finding assistant retail manager lacking in ambition. James attempted several times to change the subject or highlight positive aspects of my fictional background, but his efforts only emphasized the growing divide at the table. I could see him struggling between defending me and trying to understand my bizarre behavior. The breaking point came during dessert. Mr. Preston, who worked in finance, mentioned a recent major data breach at a national retail chain. Absolutely devastating for businesses without proper security protocols, he said. The company's stock plummeted 30% overnight. Before I could stop myself, I responded, actually, their fundamental security architecture was sound. The breach came through a third-party vendor with access to their customer database. It's why we recommend segmented access protocols even for trusted partners. The table went silent. I froze, realizing I'd just spoken like the tech CEO. I actually was not the retail worker I was pretending to be. Catherine asked sharply. I mean, that's what I read in an article. I backpedaled clumsily. I follow that stuff. Interesting, you know. James was staring at me now, genuine confusion and the first hints of suspicion in his eyes. But worse was yet to come. As coffee was being served, my phone rang. I'd forgotten to silence it, and the custom ringtone specifically coded for my company's emergency line filled the dining room. Before I could decline the call, Catherine's eyes widened with recognition. That's a unique ringtone, she said. Wait a minute. Antonia. Not Antonia Reed, the founder of Secure Small. The blood drained from my face as Catherine pulled out her phone and quickly searched something. Turning her screen toward me, she displayed a business magazine feature with my photo and the headline, Under 30 Tech Leaders Transforming Cybersecurity. Is there something you'd like to share with everyone, Anna? Catherine asked, emphasizing my fake name with newfound understanding. The room fell deadly silent. Margaret's expression shifted from disdain to shock. Richard lowered his coffee cup slowly, and James, my James, looked utterly betrayed. I can explain, I began, but Margaret cut me off. Go to the hall, let the guests laugh. Ungegeint. She shouted, her composure shattering completely. We've been made fools of in our own home. As I stood frozen in place, something unexpected happened. Richard began to applaud slowly, deliberately. One by one, the Prestons joined in, followed by Catherine, their slow, sarcastic clapping, the most humiliating sound I'd ever heard. Bravo, Richard said coldly. A truly remarkable performance. Only James remained silent, his expression a mixture of confusion, hurt, and growing anger. As our eyes met across the table, I realized the full magnitude of what I'd done. My test had backfired spectacularly, and I'd just destroyed the best thing in my life. The silence in James's car as we drove back to New York was suffocating. After the disastrous revelation at dinner, things had unraveled quickly. James had tersely announced we would not be staying overnight after all. Margaret didn't protest clearly, eager to have me out of her house. Richard had watched with detached interest, like a scientist observing a particularly disappointing experiment. Only Catherine had made eye contact as we left, her expression unreadable. Now 20 minutes into our drive and still in silence, I couldn't bear it any longer. James, please say something, I pleaded. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. What exactly would you like me to say, Antonia? Or is it Anna? I'm not even sure who I'm speaking to right now. The controlled anger in his voice was worse than if he'd shouted. James rarely showed anger, which made this quiet fury all the more devastating. I'm sorry. I said the words, feeling woefully inadequate. I can explain why I did it. Please do, he replied, eyes fixed on the road. Explain why you created an elaborate lie about your identity. Explain why you made me unwittingly participate in humiliating my family. Explain why you didn't trust me enough to be honest. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. You talked about how judgmental your parents are, how they never approved of anyone you dated. I was terrified they wouldn't accept me because I wasn't from their world. I thought if I presented as someone from a completely different background and they rejected me, it would prove they only care about status. James finally glanced at me, his expression incredulous. So your solution was to lie to everyone, including me, to create this ridiculous charade. It was Sophia's idea, I said, immediately regretting the attempt to deflect blame. But you chose to go through with it, he countered. You lied to my face for weeks planning this. Every time you talked about what you'd wear, how you'd act, you were setting up this deception. Did it ever occur to you what that would do to me? How it would make me look to my family? His words hit me like physical blows. I hadn't fully considered how my plan would affect James, how it would undermine his judgment in his parents' eyes. I was scared, I admitted. I've never fit in with people like your family. I don't have the right background, the right education, the right connections. But that's exactly it, James exploded, finally raising his voice. You don't have to fit some preconceived mold. I fell in love with you, Antonia Reed. Brilliant, driven, honest, or so I thought. I didn't need you to pretend to be anyone else. And if my parents couldn't accept you, that would have been their problem, not yours. Tears streamed down my face as the full impact of my mistake hit me. In my insecurity, I'd created the very situation I feared. Instead of being rejected for who I was, I'd destroyed trust by being someone I wasn't. The worst part, James continued, his voice quieter now but still intense, is that you thought so little of me. Did you really believe I would let my parents dictate who I love, that I couldn't stand up for you if needed? You didn't trust me at all, did you? I had no good answer. He was right. My actions showed a fundamental lack of trust, not just in his parents, but in James himself, in the strength of our relationship. When we finally reached my apartment building, James put the car in park but left the engine running, a clear sign he wouldn't be coming up. I need time, he said, staring straight ahead. I don't know what to think right now. About you, about us, about anything. James, please. I began, desperate to fix what I'd broken. No, he cut me off firmly. Not now. I need space to figure out if I can trust you again. I got out of the car with leaden limbs, watching through tears as James drove away without looking back. Standing alone on the sidewalk, I'd never felt more like a failure. Not in business, not in my entire life. The week that followed was excruciating. I called and texted James repeatedly the first 2 days until a terse message asked me to please respect his request for space. After that, I forced myself to stop, though checking my phone became an obsessive habit. Sophia came over with wine and sympathy, but even she acknowledged the plan had been fundamentally flawed. I never thought you'd go full soap opera with it, she admitted. I pictured you maybe dressing down a bit, not creating an entire fake persona. My work suffered as I moved through days in a fog of regret. I cancelled meetings, delegated important decisions, and spent hours staring at my office wall, replaying every moment of that disastrous dinner. My assistant, worried by my uncharacteristic behaviour, started making excuses to clients about a fictional mild illness. At night, I couldn't sleep, tormented by the memory of James's face when he realised the extent of my deception. I'd been so focused on being accepted by his family that I'd risked the one person who already accepted me completely. On the 8th day of silence, as I was seriously considering a desperate visit to James's office, my phone rang with an unknown number. My heart leapt, thinking it might be James calling from a different phone, but the woman's voice that answered my hopeful "hello" belonged to Catherine. "Antonia," she said without preamble. "We need to talk. Coffee tomorrow, 2 o'clock at Bluestone on West 74th. Before I could respond, she'd hung up, leaving me both terrified and clinging to a thin thread of hope. Catherine had been the one to expose me, but also the only Harrington who hadn't seemed entirely horrified by my true identity. What could she possibly want to discuss? The next day, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, nervously selecting a corner table where we could speak privately. Catherine arrived precisely at 2, dressed in casual but obviously expensive clothes. Her manner businesslike, but not overtly hostile. After ordering, she got straight to the point. "What you did was manipulative, dishonest, and frankly bizarre," she stated, stirring her cappuccino. "But I think I understand why you did it. This was not what I expected." "You do. My parents have that effect on people," she said with a surprising hint of sympathy. "They've been measuring James's partners against impossible standards for years. Did you know they had private investigators look into his last 2 serious girlfriends?" My shock must have shown on my face, because Catherine nodded grimly. "That's the world we come from. Nothing is ever taken at face value, especially not relationships that might affect the precious Harrington lineage," she added with unmistakable bitterness. "So while your approach was wrong-headed and hurt my brother deeply, I recognize the fear that drove it." Her words offered a small measure of relief. At least someone understood my misguided motives, even if they couldn't excuse my actions. "There's something else you should know," Catherine continued. "My father isn't what he appears to be either." I frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" Catherine leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Richard Harrington, pillar of high society, he grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh. His father was a steel worker. He won a scholarship to Princeton, married my mother, whose family had the actual old money, and has been performing the role of blue-blooded patriarch ever since." This revelation stunned me. The imposing, judgmental Richard Harrington had come from humble beginnings. "He never speaks about it," Catherine explained. "Mother's family essentially bought him a new identity, and he embraced it completely, which is why your little performance struck such a nerve. You inadvertently held up a mirror to his own carefully constructed persona." "And your mother?" I asked, trying to process this new information. "Old money, definitely, but her family was nearly bankrupt when she met my father. His drive and business acumen restored the family fortune. Her coldness comes from deep insecurity. She's terrified of anything that might expose the cracks in her perfect world. As Catherine shared more about the complex dynamics of the Harrington family, I began to see them not as intimidating aristocrats, but as deeply flawed humans hiding behind wealth and privilege. "What about James?" I finally asked, unable to contain the question any longer. How is he? Catherine's expression softened slightly. Hurt, confused, but also defensive of you, which has been interesting to watch. Defensive, even after what I did. The morning after you left, Mother went on a tirade about your deception, calling you every name in the book. James shut her down completely, told her your actual accomplishments, how you built your company from nothing, said that even though he was angry with you, he wouldn't let anyone disparage your character or achievements. Tears pricked at my eyes. Even in his hurt, James had defended me. "So what now?" I asked. "He won't answer my calls. I've tried apologizing, but he won't even speak to me." Catherine considered me thoughtfully. "Write him a letter, an actual handwritten letter, and write to my parents too." "Your parents?" I echoed incredulously. "They must hate me." "Probably," she agreed with surprising candor. "But if you want a future with James, you need to address what happened with all of us. Be completely honest, no strategic omissions, no performative remorse, just raw truth." "And you think that will work?" She shrugged. "I have no idea, but I know my brother loves you, or at least the real you that he thought he knew. That's worth fighting for, isn't it?" As our conversation concluded, Catherine offered one final piece of advice. "My father respects resilience and honesty even when it's uncomfortable. Start there. As for my mother," she grimaced slightly, "that's a tougher road, but not impossible." That evening, I purchased expensive stationery and spent hours drafting and redrafting 3 painful letters. To James, I poured out my heart, explaining my insecurities without excusing my actions, acknowledging the pain I'd caused, and asking not for forgiveness, but for a chance to rebuild trust. To Richard, I wrote with professional respect, one self-made person to another, once I understood his background. To Margaret, I wrote with humble recognition of her position and a genuine apology for disrupting her home and family. After mailing the letters, I entered a new kind of waiting period. Not the desperate hourly phone checking of before, but a more resigned, reflective state. I refocused on my company, threw myself into new projects, and tried to learn from my mistake rather than simply dwelling on it. 2 weeks passed with no response from any Harrington. I had begun to accept that perhaps some mistakes can't be undone when an email arrived from Richard Harrington requesting a meeting at his New York office the following day. Richard Harrington's corner office in Midtown Manhattan offered a commanding view of Central Park. As his assistant showed me in, I was struck by the calculated impression the space created. Every element from the antique desk to the modern art on the walls conveyed power and wealth, but in a way that would intimidate visitors while making them aspire to similar success. Richard himself rose from behind his desk, his expression neutral but not overtly hostile. "Ms. Reed," he said, gesturing to a chair, "thank you for coming. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Harrington." I replied, determined to maintain my composure despite my racing heart. He studied me for a moment. "Your letter was unexpected, but hopefully appreciated." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Direct. Good. I've had enough performances to last a lifetime." He returned to his seat, folding his hands on the desk. "Catherine tells me she informed you about my background." "She did," I confirmed, "though I'd like to hear your perspective if you're willing to share it." This seemed to surprise him. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing a fraction. "What would you like to know?" "How did you do it?" I asked. "Transition from one world to another so completely that no one questions your belonging." Richard considered the question thoughtfully. Observation, imitation, then adaptation. I watched how people with generational wealth carried themselves, learned their references, their subtle signals. But the key was understanding it's not just about mimicking behaviors, it's about internalizing a mindset. A mindset of belonging, I suggested. Precisely. The greatest barrier for outsiders isn't education or even money, it's the persistent feeling of being an imposter. The moment you betray that feeling, they sense it like sharks smelling blood. His words resonated deeply with my own experience. That's exactly what I was afraid of with your family. That no matter how successful I was, I'd always be seen as an outsider. That's why I created that ridiculous test. Richard nodded slowly. A test that backfired spectacularly. "I know," I admitted. It was immature, insecure, and ultimately destructive. I hurt James and insulted your family. There's no excuse for it. No, he agreed. There isn't. But there is perhaps an explanation I can understand. He leaned forward, his gaze direct. Do you know what I recognized in you that night beneath the absurd performance fear? The same fear I carried for years in Margaret's world. This candid admission stunned me. You did? Why do you think I applauded? He asked. Not just mockery, though there was certainly that. Recognition. You were playing a role just as I have. Difference is, I've been playing mine for 35 years. He rose and moved to the window, looking out over the park. I love my wife, but her world has never fully accepted me. I've built an empire, raised 2 children, donated millions to the right causes, and still, at certain moments, I see the doubt in their eyes. The whispers that I'm not quite one of them. Turning back to me, his expression held none of the judgment from the dinner. Your mistake wasn't fear, Antonia. We all have fear. Your mistake was letting it drive you to dishonesty with James most of all. I know, I said quietly. I betrayed his trust completely. I'm not sure he'll ever forgive me. My son is hurt, Richard acknowledged. But he's also still in love with you, which makes this complicated for him. Hope flickered in my chest. He is. Don't mistake my candor for approval, Richard warned. What you did showed poor judgment and a fundamental lack of trust in my son, trust that he has earned through his character and actions. I nodded, accepting the rebuke as fair. I know, and I will spend however long it takes earning back his trust if he'll let me. Richard returned to his desk, his demeanor shifting back to businessman. Margaret will be more difficult. She perceives your actions as a direct attack on her world, her values. And was it? I asked, genuinely curious how he saw it. He considered this. Perhaps unintentionally. You wanted to expose her prejudice, but in doing so, you confirmed her worst fears about outsiders, that they're deceptive, playing a game, mocking the rules she lives by. I never meant to mock, I insisted. Intention and impact are different things, he pointed out. You're a CEO. You understand this. He was right, of course. In business, I was always careful to consider how my actions would be perceived, not just how I meant them. I'd failed to apply the same principle to my personal life. Where do we go from here? I asked finally. Richard studied me carefully. That depends on several factors. James must make his own decision about your relationship. Margaret will take time, if ever, to come around. And you? I'm a businessman, Ms. Reed. I believe in calculated risks and second chances when the potential return justifies it. He extended his hand across the desk. Don't waste this one. As I shook his hand, I understood this wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was a provisional acceptance contingent on actions yet to be taken. There's an event at our summer house in 2 weeks, he added as I prepared to leave. An annual garden party. James will be there. So will Margaret. Consider this an invitation. The invitation was clearly both an opportunity and a test. I accepted it with appropriate gravity, understanding that how I handled myself at this event would significantly impact my future with the Harrington family. As I left Richard's office, I felt a curious mixture of anxiety and hope. The path forward would be difficult, but at least now there was a path. True to Richard's warning, I heard nothing from Margaret. James remained silent as well, though Catherine texted occasionally with neutral updates, neither encouraging nor discouraging. I focused on preparing for the garden party, selecting an outfit that was elegant but understated, professional but not overly formal. This time I would present my authentic self, no performance, no pretense. The 2 weeks passed both too quickly and agonizingly slowly. When the day finally arrived, I drove myself to the Harrington's summer estate in Greenwich, determined to face whatever came with dignity and honesty. The Harrington's summer estate made their main residence look modest by comparison. Set on several acres of manicured grounds overlooking Long Island Sound, the sprawling white mansion gleamed in the afternoon sun. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, and well-dressed guests mingled on the vast lawn, where staff in crisp uniforms served champagne and hors d'oeuvres. As I parked my car and smoothed my simple but elegant blue dress, I took several deep breaths to steady myself. This would be my first time seeing James since our disastrous dinner and subsequent breakup. It would also be my first encounter with Margaret since she'd ordered me from her home. A staff member directed me through the house to the back gardens. I scanned the crowd anxiously, spotting Richard first. He acknowledged me with a subtle nod, but made no move to approach. Catherine stood nearby and offered a small, encouraging smile, but it was Margaret's reaction I noticed most keenly, the momentary narrowing of her eyes, before she deliberately turned her back, continuing her conversation with an elderly couple as if I didn't exist. And then I saw James. He stood near the rose garden, drink in hand, engaged in conversation with a young woman I didn't recognize. My heart clenched at the sight of him, at once so familiar and so distant. He looked good, if slightly tired, the subtle shadows under his eyes the only indication of any distress. As if sensing my presence, he glanced up. Our eyes met across the lawn, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he excused himself from his companion and began walking toward me with measured steps. "Antonia," he said when he reached me, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Your father invited me," I replied. "I hope that's okay," James nodded. "He mentioned it." An awkward silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. "You look well," I offered finally. "You too," he replied. Then after a pause, "Did you get my letter?" My heart sank. "No, I didn't receive anything." His brow furrowed. "I wrote to you last week. I left it with your doorman." The explanation clicked immediately. "I've been staying at Sophia's," I explained. After everything happened, my apartment felt too empty. Something like relief crossed his features. "I thought you were ignoring my response." "Never," I assured him. "What did it say?" James glanced around at the nearby guests. "This isn't the place. Can we walk?" He led me away from the main gathering toward a secluded path through carefully tended gardens. Once we were out of earshot, he stopped beneath a flowering dogwood tree. "I'm still angry." He began, his directness both painful and refreshing. "What you did hurt me deeply. Not just the lie itself, but what it suggested about how you see me, how little you trusted me." "I know," I acknowledged. "And you have every right to be angry. I betrayed your trust in the worst way." "But," he continued, looking out over the garden rather than at me, "I've had time to think about why you might have felt that was necessary, about the things I told you about my family, the pressure I knew you'd face." He finally turned to me. "I didn't prepare you adequately. I downplayed their judgmental tendencies because I was afraid you'd run if you knew how difficult they could be. So in a way, I wasn't completely honest either." "That doesn't excuse what I did," I insisted. "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "But it helps me understand it, especially after talking with Catherine about your conversation." We began walking again, the tension between us slightly eased but still present. "I'm not ready to pick up where we left off," James said finally. "Too much has happened. But I'm not ready to give up on us entirely either." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an opening, and I grasped it gratefully. "What does that mean for us now?" "It means we start over, slowly, with complete honesty this time from both of us." He stopped walking and turned to face me. No more tests, no more protecting each other from difficult truths. Just two people figuring out if they can rebuild what was broken. "I'd like that," I said softly. More than anything. A slight smile, the first I'd seen from him in weeks, warmed his features. Me too. As we returned to the party, I felt a fragile hope beginning to take root. James stayed by my side as we rejoined the gathering, not demonstrative, but clearly signalling to others that we were navigating this event together. Richard approached us, his expression revealing nothing. "Antonia, I see you and James have had a chance to talk." "We have," I confirmed, matching his neutral tone. "Good. There's someone who'd like to speak with you." He gestured across the lawn to where Margaret stood alone, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. James squeezed my hand briefly. "You don't have to if you're not ready." "No, I should," I replied, gathering my courage. "It's time." Margaret watched my approach with the wary assessment of someone encountering a potentially dangerous animal. When I reached her, she spoke before I could offer any greeting. "Richard seems to think you deserve another chance," she said without preamble. "He rarely misjudges character in business, though his personal assessments can be more sentimental." It wasn't a warm welcome, but it was an opening of sorts. "Thank you for allowing me to attend today," I said carefully. "I know my presence can't be comfortable for you." "No," she agreed bluntly. "It isn't." We stood in silence for a moment, the party continuing around us. "James is my only son," Margaret said finally, her voice lower. "Everything I've done, the social connections I've cultivated, the reputation I've built, has been to secure his future, to ensure doors would always be open to him." I hadn't expected this candor from her. "You love him very much." "Of course I do," she replied, an edge of irritation in her tone, which is why I cannot understand how you could deceive him so thoroughly, humiliate him in front of family friends. I was wrong, I admitted simply. Terribly wrong. I let my insecurities about meeting you lead me to make a terrible decision that hurt everyone involved, especially James. Margaret studied me, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. You were afraid of us. Terrified. I confirmed. James spoke so highly of you, but also about your expectations, your standards. I was certain you'd find me lacking. Something shifted in her eyes, a brief glimpse of understanding, before her guard returned. So your solution was to ensure we would definitely find you lacking a peculiar strategy. Despite everything, I found myself smiling at her dry assessment. Not my finest moment of decision-making, clearly. No, she agreed, but with less frost than before. After a moment, she asked, and now what are your intentions regarding my son? To rebuild his trust if he'll let me, to be worthy of a second chance. And if I continue to object to your relationship? I considered my answer carefully. I would hope to change your mind over time, but ultimately, that decision would be between James and me. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. At least you're honest this time. She glanced across the lawn to where James stood watching us anxiously. He hasn't been himself since that dinner, neither angry nor sad exactly, just diminished. Until today. She turned back to me with renewed assessment. I don't forgive easily, Antonia, but my son's happiness matters more than my pride. Remember that. With that cryptic statement, she nodded curtly and walked away, leaving me to puzzle over whether I'd just received a subtle blessing or a final warning. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a strange limbo. James and I circulated separately, but reconnected periodically, our interactions cautious but increasingly comfortable. Catherine proved an unexpected ally, deliberately including me in conversations with other guests, many of whom clearly knew some version of the dinner fiasco, but were too well-mannered to mention it directly. As the event wound down, James found me near the terrace steps. Would you like to have dinner next week? He asked. To talk more. I'd like that very much, I replied, careful not to seem too eager despite my racing heart. I'll call you, he promised. Then after a slight hesitation, he leaned in and kissed my cheek. Goodbye, Antonia. The real Antonia. Driving away from the Harrington estate that evening, I felt a cautious optimism I hadn't experienced in weeks. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, I believed it was a road worth travelling, not just for James, but for my own growth as well. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn evening, I once again found myself approaching the Harrington estate in Connecticut. This time, however, I arrived with James beside me, his hand clasped firmly in mine, my engagement ring back on my finger after a period of careful reconciliation. The occasion was a rescheduled engagement dinner, smaller than originally planned, but significant in its symbolic fresh start. As we entered the now familiar entrance hall, I marveled at how different I felt compared to my first visit. No deception, no performance, just genuine nervous excitement about formally joining our families. The months following the garden party had been a deliberate, sometimes difficult journey of rebuilding. James and I had started with weekly dinners, gradually increasing our time together as trust was slowly restored. We attended couples therapy, where I confronted the deep insecurities that had driven my deception, and James acknowledged the pressure he'd felt as the Harrington heir. My relationship with Richard had evolved into something approaching mutual respect. He appreciated my business acumen and resilience, occasionally even seeking my input on cybersecurity matters for Harrington Enterprises. Margaret remained more reserved, but her initial hostility had given way to a cautious acceptance. Catherine had become surprisingly a genuine friend. Ready? James asked as we paused at the entrance to the dining room where his family awaited. Completely, I replied, squeezing his hand. No more hiding. The dinner proceeded with a warmth that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Richard told embarrassing stories about James's childhood. Margaret actually laughed when I recounted a recent business mishap, and Catherine teased us both about our wedding plans. After dinner, Margaret asked me to join her in the conservatory, while the others enjoyed drinks in the study. As we sat surrounded by exotic plants, I waited nervously for whatever she wanted to discuss in private. You've surprised me, Antonia. She began, her usual formality slightly softened. When James told us he wanted to proceed with the engagement, I had serious reservations. I understand, I replied. I gave you every reason to doubt me. Yes, you did, she agreed without hesitation. But you've also shown remarkable perseverance since then. Not many would have withstood the scrutiny you've faced from this family. James is worth it, I said simply. Margaret nodded slowly. On that we agree. She hesitated before continuing. I need to explain something about my initial reaction to you both as the successful entrepreneur and as your alternative persona. I listened attentively, sensing this was an important moment for us both. My objection was never truly about your background, she admitted. Richard didn't come from money, as you now know. My family barely had any left when we married, despite our name. Then what was it? I asked gently. Margaret looked away, her profile suddenly vulnerable. Fear of being replaced. Every time James brought home someone accomplished independent, I saw a woman who wouldn't need me, who would create a separate life and family that excluded us. Her voice grew quieter. When my mother-in-law was alive, she made it very clear I wasn't the wife she wanted for Richard. I've spent 35 years feeling like an intruder in my own family. This revelation stunned me. Margaret Harrington, the intimidating social gatekeeper, had been protecting herself from the very rejection she so readily inflicted on others. I'm not trying to replace you in James's life, I assured her. I want us to be family, not competitors. She smiled thinly. I'm beginning to see that. Your persistence in facing us, even at your most unwelcome, shows a loyalty to James that I can respect, even if your methods were initially questionable. When we rejoined the others, something had shifted between us, a fragile understanding that might, with care, grow into genuine affection over time. Later that evening, in the privacy of the guest suite we now shared, James took both my hands in his. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket and producing not a box, but a folded piece of paper. I opened it to find a handwritten note. What's this? 6 months ago, our engagement ended because of broken trust, he explained. I want to begin again properly this time. The note contained a new proposal, beautiful in its simplicity and honesty. James knelt before me, taking my hand. Antonia Reed, knowing everything we've been through, everything we've learned about each other, will you marry me? Not the heir to the Harrington fortune asking the successful CEO, just James asking Antonia. Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. Yes, just Antonia saying yes to just James. As he slipped the ring back on my finger, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. My disastrous deception had nearly cost me everything, but the painful aftermath had ultimately created something more authentic and resilient than what we had before. Our wedding plans now included elements from both our worlds. My mother would be as involved as Margaret. The ceremony would blend traditions and break others. Most importantly, it would be a true joining of our authentic selves, no pretense, no performance. The experience had transformed me in ways I never expected. Through therapy and honest self-reflection, I'd confronted the deep-seated fear of rejection that had driven me to such extreme measures. I'd learned that trying to control how others perceive you ultimately prevents them from ever truly knowing you. And I'd discovered that genuine connection can only happen when we have the courage to be vulnerable, to risk being seen for who we really are. As James and I stood together at the window overlooking the Harrington grounds, now familiar, but once so intimidating, I thought about how far we'd come. The path hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Sometimes we need to break something completely before we can rebuild it stronger than before. Looking back, I could see now that my plan hadn't just been a test for the Harringtons. It had been an expression of my own fear that I wasn't enough just as I was. The greatest gift of our reconciliation was the knowledge that I was enough, imperfections and all, and that true acceptance from others and ourselves can only come when we stop performing and start being real. Have you ever created an elaborate deception that backfired or pretended to be someone you're not to impress others? How did it work out? And what did you learn? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey of authenticity and redemption, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need the reminder that they are enough exactly as they are. Thank you for listening, and remember, the most courageous thing you can do is simply be yourself.